Hello, Professor ORESKES.
Hello, Julian. Good to see you.
Well, thanks a lot for joining me on the podcast. I'm thrilled to really have the chance to spend an hour with you to discuss your perspective on some of the major challenges of our time. And to guide our conversation, we'll draw on the analysis and insights from your latest book, The Big Myth. I have a usual question that I ask first, which is, could you briefly introduce yourself and share a bit about your preferred way of looking at the world? What are the lenses through which you view and analyze society in general?
My name is NAOMI ORESKES. I'm a professor of the history of science at Harvard University and also an affiliated professor of earth and planetary sciences. I began my professional career as a scientist. I trained as a geologist. I worked as a mining and exploration geologist when I was in my 20s. And then I evolved over time to be more of a historian and philosopher of science, largely because I became very interested in the question of what is science? How does it work? How do scientists judge and evaluate evidence? And most important, if a scientist says we know that X is true, we know the climate is changing, we know that this particular virus causes this particular disease, what is that really based on? What does it really mean when scientists say we know that this is true? It's such an important question, and it's astonishingly understudied when you think about how important it is. And particularly when I was starting out, it was almost entirely unstudied in the context of earth science. Most history and philosophy of science at that time was history of physics or history of biology. So I became interested in earth science as this very important science that was quite understudied and that was clearly becoming more important in our lives as people became more aware of issues like the ozone hole and climate change, which were very much in the fore when I was in school in the late 1970s and early 1980s. In terms of my worldview today to now, I think it's a blend of being a scientist and a historian. As a person with my roots in natural science, I'm extremely interested in evidence. I'm interested in the question of how we look at the world and how it is that we see certain kinds of facts as providing evidence, but also why people resist and reject evidence. But also as a historian, I think that one can never have the answers to those questions just by looking at the current moment. The way we think about the world, the way we judge claims, the way we judge evidence is deeply historically anchored and has so much to do with the path we've traveled to get to where we are today. And that's why the answers to these questions are not the same in France as they are in the United States or Japan or Nigeria, because we all come to these questions with different experiences, different background ideologies, different priors, as the mathematicians would call it. And that means we judge and evaluate information in different ways based on those different histories. And so I think natural scientists often make a mistake when they think that they can discuss a complex and important issue like climate change or like the COVID pandemic and not take into account the historical and cultural setting.
Well, I mean, that's very relevant to where I am right now and where I think the listeners are, because if they listen to the podcast, they just ended a 7-episode series on epistemology and the history of how we build knowledge. And actually, you were mentioned in that series, when it comes to your latest works on, how we build our ideas and how we can be very, very much manipulated. And I want to dive into your latest work. Your book delves into the origins of what you call the myth of the free market. And I want to know first, how did you come up with the idea of studying this specifically, this specific constructed narrative?
In all my work, one question has led to the next question. So I certainly would not have guessed 30 years ago that I would write a book about the history of free market ideology, but it really evolved from our work on climate change denial. So when Erik Conway and I were writing Merchants of Doubt, which is now going back nearly 20 years since we started that project, the question we had in mind at that time was, why would intelligent people reject climate science? Because it was pretty clear to us, based on what was going on in America at that time, that many of the people who were rejecting climate science were not stupid, they were not uneducated, They included the president and the vice president of the United States. Say what you will about their politics, no one could ever say that Dick Cheney was an unintelligent man. And they also included some key scientists who became the focus of our work, the people we called the merchants of doubt. These four key, very powerful, very influential American scientists who were super intelligent people, quite brilliant, in fact, on the level of Nobel laureates. So it wasn't remotely possible that they didn't understand the science. So then the question was, what was motivating them? And most people assumed the answer to that question was money. But as we began to do our research, we really found a different story. We found very little evidence that they were primarily driven by money. But what we found was very strong evidence that they were motivated by a powerful political ideology, which was really the ideology of market fundamentalism, although they didn't use that term. But it was essentially a framework that argued that governments shouldn't intervene in markets because if they do, if they compromise our economic freedom, then this will lead to compromises to political and personal freedom as well. And so a large part of that book was figuring that out. And so the end of the book, we talk about market fundamentalism. We talk about what the intellectual framework is and how it informs climate change denial. But we didn't really have time in that book to figure out why they thought that in the first place. Where did these ideas come from? Especially because you don't have to know a lot about history to realize the ways in which market fundamentalist thinking is fundamentally flawed and really refuted by the experiences of history. So we set that aside as a different, separate question. Took us a few years to come back to it, but that is what motivated writing this new book. So the new book is really an attempt to answer this question. Where does market fundamentalism come from? And why do so many people accept it, even though there's so much evidence telling us that it's just not a correct picture of how the world works?
Well, I mean, we can start there, by defining what you mean by market fundamentalism. Use that term to describe the near religious belief in the market's ability to solve all problems. And so why is that? And why do you think that term particularly is appropriate?
Well, we think it's appropriate for a couple of reasons, one of which you just suggested. It is a kind of quasi-religious faith. It is fundamentalist. And we borrowed this term from George Soros, who I think borrowed it from someone else. He didn't invent it, but he is one who, first really used this term widely to describe this kind of quasi-religious faith, a sort of fundamentalist faith in the power and efficacy of markets. So we wanted to convey that aspect of it. It's very closely related to neoliberalism. One can think of it as a form of neoliberalism. And we thought about simply referring to it as neoliberalism, but we chose not to do that because we felt the term neoliberalism is thrown around so much that it's one of those terms that it's hard to really know exactly what people mean by it. John Williams, the economist who developed the Washington Consensus, says it's used as a swear word. So we felt like calling it neoliberalism wouldn't really quite capture what we were trying to convey. But market fundamentalism, and again, putting the emphasis on markets, because neoliberalism puts the emphasis on liberalism, but that's really confusing for an American audience because what we mean by liberalism today is quite different from what classical liberals meant by that term. So because the book is primarily describing things happening in the United States, and although we are super thrilled that the book is now available in France and we have several other foreign translations being produced, we really think this is a story that's really important for people around the globe to understand. But it is in certain ways a very American story. And so in that sense, we thought it was important to use a term that would be legible to our American audiences.
And I mean, to understand, how does this quasi-religious faith manifest in modern policy discussions, to be concrete? And why do you make the parallel with religion? Why is it so related to faith?
Well, we see it manifested in this very moment with the role of Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy in the upcoming Trump administration, that already, practically before the ink was even dry on the ballots back in November, we saw them immediately starting to bring back this idea of stimulating the economy through deregulation and arguing that markets are overregulated, that the government is too big, that the government needs to slash. So the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, and I say called because, of course, it's not a department, it's two people who aren't even elected. And of course, it's super ironic that these unelected people are going on and on about the overweening power of unelected administrative agencies in the government. But the whole move to try to slash government, reduce government workers is 100% aligned with market fundamentalist thinking, because market fundamentalists see government as a threat. They see government as a bad thing because they see it as a threat to individual liberty, and particularly a threat to liberty of business people. And the argument that they make, and this is part of what is superficially appealing, is to say that government is sort of a dead weight on the economy. So if you reduce government, if you let the private sector have free rein, if you let the market do its magic, that was the term that Ronald Reagan popularized, then the economy will thrive and people will do well. So if that were true, then of course you could see why people would want to reduce the size and the scale of the federal government or central government in France or Germany or wherever it is. But the problem is it's not true. It's not supported by the evidence of economics or the evidence of history. And so then when people believe something that's not supported by the evidence, then it's a kind of faith. And, you know, don't get me wrong. I don't mean to bash religion. I have great respect for people of authentic faith, but it gets taken on. I mean, I guess the important distinction here is people of faith know that belief in God is a leap of faith. And they're clear about that. And they don't pretend that religion is science. They know that religion is religion. The problem with market fundamentalism is that the economic part of it presents itself as a science. It presents itself as derived from economics, but in fact, it really isn't. And it's certainly not derived from history. So it presents itself as a kind of fact-based scientific framework, but in many, many ways it operates as a kind of quasi-religious ideology. So I'd rather just refer to it as an ideology, because I think that's the correct word to describe it. It is ideological. And so these people are driven by certain kinds of ideological commitments that don't really stand the test of empirical evidence. So in this book, Erik Conway and I are really bringing to bear both our historical credentials and our scientific credentials to say, look, this is not a science. This is not evidence-based. People are not revising their views in light of new information. Instead, they're sticking to these claims that in many ways have been shown to be false. And that's what gives it this sort of faith-like component.
And we'll get into this. I think it's interesting to understand, where this comes from, where these ideas come from, because they don't come from nowhere, and it started in the 70s. We'll get back to that. But first, I would like to understand a little bit better the frame. What are the core ideas of this ideology? Like the fact that government is bad because it threatens, freedom, or that the vision of the market as some kind of autonomous entity endowed with its own wisdom. What are the pillar of that thinking, of that ideology?
There are two key components that you just alluded to. So the first has to do with the primacy of markets, the idea that markets are the most powerful, the most effective, the most important mechanism that exists for organizing not just the economy, but society in general. And so market fundamentalists emphasize the primacy of markets. They want as many things as possible to be left to the private sector. So you'll see them arguing, like in the next few weeks, we will see already the signs are there. They'll argue for the privatization of Social Security. They'll argue for the privatization of medical services. They may even argue for the privatization of public school systems. So privatization is a central role because of this valorization of markets. And they construct the market as if it were independent. And this is, again, the sort of pseudoscientific aspect of this. They talk about the market as if it exists in the same way that the giant sequoia tree exists, or dinosaurs, or the planetary climate system. So they talk about the market as a thing, often in capital letters, the market, very Germanic. And they talk about it also in a kind of anthropomorphized way, that the market is efficient, that the market is magical, that the market has wisdom, that we can trust the invisible hand. So it's also like anthropomorphized, that the market has a bodily component. So it's almost like a kind of deification, that the market is conceptualized. There's a great book called The Market is God by one of my Harvard colleagues, Harvey Cox. So it's almost as if the market is a kind of God, a sort of deification of the market. But going along with that, the flip side of that is the demonization of government. And these two pieces go hand in hand. They really have to be understood as two sides of the same coin, because of their faith and confidence in markets, market fundamentalists are generally hostile to government, particularly centralized forms of government like the U.S. federal government or the central government in France. They see governments as threatening personal liberty. They see markets as maximizing personal choice. And so these two things go together. So they want to maximize the privatization of things in our lives, and they want to minimize the role of government. And of course, this is deeply problematic on many, many different levels. And so the book, we spend the lion's share of the book really explaining where these ideas came from and how they were developed, marketed, propagandized, given credibility through academic research, but also how at the same time they develop a political strategy to limit the power of government, and particularly where government wants to step in to protect the rights of vulnerable people or working class people, to undermine the power of unions, and also to limit the power of government to protect the natural environment.
Well, let's jump into this now to understand, where it comes from, and then I keep some of the questions to the end. I'm anticipating some of the contradictory, arguments, and I want to have your answers on that. Of course, it's interesting to see what you have to say. But I want to go into the architects of the myth. Who were these people? Who were the main architects of this ideological construction, as you describe it?
Well, I'd say that the whole project works in part because it builds on a couple of kernels of truth, right? I think every good lie or every good myth has kernels of truth, and that's what makes it potentially credible. So there are kernels of truth in this argument, and this is where it relates to neoliberalism, kernels of truth rooted in classical liberalism. So those kernels of truth have to do with the potential for centralized government to be tyrannical. And if you think about the American Revolution, the French Revolution, right, both of those are rebellions against monarchs, monarchs who reign not by the consent of the governed, but by hereditary privilege. And both the French Revolution and the American Revolution are rebelling against that. And so classical liberalism, classical Enlightenment ideals emphasize the rights of the individual. In America, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In France, fraternity, égalité. I've forgotten the third one. Fraternity.
Liberté, égalité, fraternité.
Liberté, exactly. So similar concepts in both countries. And so the idea is that protecting the rights of the individual is crucial to a democratic polity. So that's not wrong. I think most of us would agree with that. And we can understand its roots in the reaction against monarchy. So neoliberals take that, but they develop it more than 100 years later, 150 years later, in a very different context where we're no longer dealing with a hereditary monarchy. We're actually dealing with democracies that are elected and should, at least in ideal cases, represent the will of the people. But they turn it on its head in order to limit the power of government based on a renewed argument about the rights of individuals, but also about the power of the marketplace. And here they draw on what we argue is a misrepresentation of Adam Smith, so a misrepresentation of classical economics, but also, and crucially, Austrian economics. So the core of 20th century neoliberalism comes out of a group of people in Austria led by a number of different people, but the two we focus on in our book are Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich von Hayek, because these are the two that the Americans relied on the most. So both von Mises and von Hayek begin to develop this argument that we've already discussed about markets helping to protect individual rights. So the argument, in a way, they're flipping classical liberalism on its head. Instead of depending on democratic elected governments to protect our rights, they now say, actually, government is a threat to our rights. And I'll tell you in a minute why. The thing that really protects our rights is the marketplace, because in the marketplace, we make decisions and power is distributed to all the different people who are buying and selling things in the marketplace. So the more you rely on markets, the more you distribute power and you prevent its concentration in centralized government. And the centralized government that they particularly have in mind is the Soviet Union. And von Mises, in particular, develops this argument against socialism. He says, socialism can never be democratic because the moment you concentrate economic power in a centrally planned economy run by, a Politburo or whoever it is, necessarily, in order to enforce the plan, they have to tell people what to do. They have to tell you where you can work, which factory will build how many tractors means also saying how many people will work in that factory. They'll have to tell you where you can live, what job you can have. And so socialism will necessarily lead to totalitarianism. And this is the argument that's picked up on Friedrich von Hayek in his book Road to Serfdom. Now, this is where the details really matter. And this is what I would say to skeptical counter-arguments. Von Mises was not entirely wrong about that. He certainly had an important point about the risks of centrally planned economies as operating in the Soviet Union. But what he and von Hayek do then is to say, but it's not just a centralized economy. It's any concentration of power in a central government, even in a democratically elected government. And that move, to me, is very powerful and very noxious, because now they begin to try to undermine the legitimacy of democratically elected governments, which are very, very different than the totalitarian governments of the Soviet Union. And it's that thread that gets picked up in the United States. And in the book, we tell, exactly how that's done. But a key part of it is that a group of American businessmen, sort of captains of industry, factory owners, people associated with Fortune 500 companies like DuPont and General Motors, very, very famous companies, famous people like Alfred Sloan, actually bring von Mises and von Hayek to America. They import these foreign theorists, they get them jobs in American universities, and then they begin to promote their work both in popular contexts and in academic life in order to give credibility to these ideas in the American context.
Well, it's good that we go a little bit in the past, we go back to the past, because I want to go to the beginning, where and when did it really start to pick up again? I understand at first it was an ideology that was based on critics of communism, and states that are centralized. And also, I guess there was also that willingness for economic efficiency, and try to maximize, profits, etc. And you mentioned that the rise of market fundamentalism began with Carter and then accelerated with Reagan in the early 80s in the US and Thatcher in the UK, and also continued with accelerated actually under Clinton. Could you walk us through the key milestone that really solidified that ideology, first in the US and then through the globalization to, across the globe?
Well, I think there's a few things. One of the things we show in the book is how the market fundamentalists develop this framework, develop this ideology, and then they're ready. They're sort of standing ready for the moment or the opportunity where they can then push these ideas, which up until the 1970s have been rejected by most of the American people and are not considered credible, even by most conservatives and even by most Republican leaders. So, for example, President Dwight Eisenhower, who I would say was sort of, I don't know what the right way to describe it is, but the last Republican president who, Nixon's not really a market fundamental, but I'll just spit it out. The last good Republican president. I think Dwight Eisenhower was in many ways a great president, and he fully accepted that government had to play a key role in addressing the failures of capitalism. So, for example, Social Security to protect people against extreme poverty. And there's a famous letter that we quote in the books where he says to his brother, any party that wanted to eliminate Social Security, you'd never hear from that party again. And then he says, well, there are a few people who want to do that, but their number is minuscule and they're stupid. So, there's really this very strong consensus after the Great Depression and World War II that the American government needs to play a bigger role in protecting people from market failures, the abuses of capitalism, abuses of labor, this sort of thing. But it begins to change in the 1970s. And one of the really interesting things about Milton Friedman, who's one of the key economists who promotes these ideas in the United States after World War II, is he actually says the role of the intellectual is to have the ideas ready so that when the moment comes, they can be implemented. And that begins in the 1970s with Jimmy Carter because of a set of events that, economists would call exogenous events that happen in the world that are not internally caused by anything in the United States or anything in the United Kingdom, but it has to do with the rise of stagflation. So typically economists think of inflation or unemployment or inflation in a stagnant economy as being one or the other. So if the economy is boisterous, good, growing, that's a good thing. You have low unemployment, but it tends to be inflationary. On the contrary, if you have a weak economy, low growth, that's bad for employment, but it tends to keep inflation in check. So it's often been viewed as a trade-off. And one of the functions of centralized banks like the Fed in the United States or the central bank in England has been to manage interest rates to sort of manage that balance between economic growth and inflation. And in the post-war period, this seemed to be working pretty well until the 1970s. And then something happened. And we saw, both in the United States and in Europe, stagflation, a stagnant economy with low growth, yet high, in some cases, very, very high rates of inflation. In some parts of the world, double-digit inflation. And this was both really bad for people and also confusing. And so into that breach, the market fundamentalists said, we have the answer. We know what is driving this. And they said there's two things that are driving it: excessive public spending, particularly in Europe, and an overly regulated economy. And this is the argument that Margaret Thatcher particularly picks up in the United Kingdom in the 1970s, but also then Jimmy Carter as well. People begin to accept that argument. And again, it has some kernel of truth. So in the United States, and we talk about this in the book, there were a lot of regulations put in place during the Great Depression, some of which just didn't make any sense anymore because the world had changed. So regulations to do with telecommunications, regulations to do with trucking. And so there was a plausible, credible argument that some of those regulations needed to be revisited or maybe even eliminated. But the neoliberals take it way too far, in our opinion. In the United Kingdom, the issue there is trickier, but similar, and it has a lot to do with unions. So unions in the United Kingdom had become very, very powerful, and there had been some general strikes that had really upset a lot of British people, brought the country to a standstill. And Margaret Thatcher comes and says, this is outrageous. This is ridiculous. These unions have way too much power. And I think that probably most British people agreed that there was some truth in that. So this combination of the argument that unions became too powerful, markets are too regulated, we need to back off, and there's too much public spending, the government needs to back off and leave more things to the marketplace. And so again, not necessarily an entirely incorrect argument, but in my opinion, and I think the opinion of many people, Thatcher and then Reagan begin to take it way too far. And they begin to try to undo many of the protections, the legitimate protections that had been put in place for labor, for workers, and particularly the area that brought me and Erik Conway to this work, the environment. And so in the Reagan administration, particularly, we begin to see the attempt to unravel the environmental protections that had been put in place, mostly in the 60s and 70s, that had really done a huge amount of benefit to clean up the air and the water of the United States, and to begin this program of trying to dismantle those protections under the name of deregulation. And that's the other key move that Reagan makes that's very important to understand. The word deregulation is initially used to refer to regulated markets like aviation, regulated aviation or regulated trucking. But he uses it then also to refer to undoing environmental protection or undoing protections for child labor or for workers. And so he expands the realm of, quote, deregulation to be not just about specific markets that might benefit from more competition, but also about undoing the role of government in protecting the environment, workers, and the vulnerable.
I want also to understand the balance there was between basically trying to be efficient economically, and some might argue that also framing this as a myth dismisses the genuine success of free market principles in fostering innovation and economic growth, and basically the ideology that is not directly related to economic efficiency, but more to basically freeing up the market, freeing up the country, and letting people get rich. And if like, there are two parts in this, because one might say that you can generally think that by doing this and freeing the market, you can build a better common goods. You see what I mean? It's not just
totally.
about...
Okay, can I jump in? Because nothing
sure.
gets my blood boiling more than that argument. So first of all, it's just false. And I mean, your compatriot Piketty has shown how it's false. I mean, massive income inequality is not good for countries. We see many different ways in which it damages democracy, damages public health, damages the common good. So the idea that somehow we build the common good by letting a small number of people become super, super rich, it's just, I'm not even going to call that a myth. I'm going to call that a lie. We know that that is false. And it's very upsetting, actually, to hear people who I think know that that's not true make that claim. So that's, but if we go back to the sort of more subtle part of the argument that I can be calmer about, so it's really important to investigate this. So as you said, many people make the claim that markets are efficient and government is inefficient. Well, go find me the paper or papers where that's ever been proven. One of the astonishing things about economics, and I didn't set out this book to be a tirade or a polemic against the field of economics, and I often get asked about that. And the purpose of this book is not to say that economics is not a science. I think there are many excellent economics who do work that is scientific, but there's also this strain in some parts of economics that takes principles as articles of faith in a very inadequately examined way. And this argument about efficient markets is one of them. And one of the really astonishing things we found when we were writing this book is when John Williams says, well, actually, it's really interesting. We always say markets are efficient, but, you actually can't find the place where anybody ever showed that that was true. And then he kind of says, well, it must be true because everyone believes it. And hello? Wait, what? So the fact is, there are reasons to believe that markets can be efficient in many contexts, but there's also reasons to believe that they can be quite inefficient. And we see this in healthcare. When you compare the United States to Europe, where in the United States we have a much more privatized medical system, healthcare costs are wildly higher in the United States than they are in Europe, and we do not get better results. We get worse results. So the healthcare markets in the United States are extremely inefficient. And that's just one example. The flip side about government, so everyone would like to say, oh, the government is so inefficient. Well, I mean, where was that ever proven? Actually, we have many programs in the United States and in Europe that have worked very well to do what they were designed to do. And Social Security in the United States is the obvious example. We used to have massive amounts of poverty among the elderly in the United States. We have almost no poverty among the elderly in the United States today. And I think one of the reasons that the Republicans consistently attack Social Security is that it disproves their theories. It's an efficient government program that works well, that does what it's intended to do, and people like it. And so if they were to acknowledge that was true, it would be a major refutation of their broad, generalized claim about government inefficiency. So they can't admit that. And so instead, they frankly lie about Social Security, and they've been lying about it for a long time.
Well, I want to understand, how these ideas progressed. Because as you said, 50 years ago, everybody in the political class in the US were thinking that this was nuts, to think that the government didn't have a role to play. And now it's the contrary. So how did this progress? And why did, for example, Democrats who historically championed regulation embraced this market vision during the Clinton era? And what was the roles of the think tanks that you mentioned in the book?
Yeah, so the piece about why Democrats embraced it is really complicated. So let me answer the first part too. I think the answer about how these ideas came to the fore, I think there's really three things. So one is what we've already said. There's a kernel of truth in some of the arguments. And there's no question that in the 1970s, there was a significant problem about trying to understand stagflation and also trying to revisit regulations from the 1920s and 30s that really didn't make sense 50 years later. But a big part of it also is persistence, money, and organization. And what we show in the book, and this is why the book is so long and you don't have to read it all, but, we had to be persistent enough to show their persistence. They're really, really persistent. The story begins in the early 20th century with debates over child labor and workplace accidents and death. And many, many people in the United States during what we call the progressive era were talking about the failures of capitalism, the social cost of capitalism, the huge numbers of children that worked in dangerous conditions, the huge numbers of workers who were killed or injured on the job every single year, the huge numbers of people who had jobs and yet were living in poverty. And so a set of reforms were put in place to address these real recognized failures of free market or mostly unregulated capitalism. The business community took this as a great affront on their prerogatives. And also another component of this is social Darwinism. We can get into that if we want to. But they took it as a really profound personal insult that the government was telling them how to run their businesses. And they didn't like that. And so they begin to develop this argument. But they realize that if they just say, well, I want the right to exploit children in my factories, I want the right to kill workers in my factories and on my railroads and in my mines, most people would say, no, you don't have the right to do that. But if they said, well, but I have the common good at heart, I want to develop prosperity that will help all American people, that's a much more credible argument. And so very quickly they realize they will not win this case defending child labor, but they will win the case, or they could win the case, if they cast it as a question of freedom and personal choice and liberté, right? Super important to all of us. And so they begin to develop that argument, and they do it over a long period of time and in many different ways. So starting seriously in the 1920s with debates about electricity regulation, running up to the present day, they have cultivated these arguments in many different ways. And so in the book we show, one of the things they do are propaganda campaigns, overt propaganda campaigns that they themselves acknowledge are propaganda, advertising, marketing, pamphlets, magazines, lecture series, newsletters aimed at teachers, at religious leaders, and really bombarding the cultural landscape with these arguments. And they know that it won't happen overnight, but they have the persistence, the money, and the organization to do it. And so in the book, we show how that begins in the 20s and 30s with efforts to influence curricula at universities, to rewrite textbooks used in schools, and then we carry it forward through radio, television, and into American politics in the Reagan period.
And supporters of deregulation argue that it has often led to innovation and increased consumer choice, and it's protecting, freedom. What do you make of this claim, particularly in industries like technology or, aviation?
Yeah. Well, that's another one that makes my blood boil, because either they're lying or they're idiots, because no one who knows anything about the history of technology can possibly think that that's true. And It's interesting because before we decided to write this book, that was actually the book that Erik and I were thinking about writing. And we actually had hired a research assistant. We had a lot of notes about it. And then Mariano Mazzucato wrote The Entrepreneurial State, which it's a little different than the book we would have written, of course, but essentially makes the same argument. And the argument is this: the idea that technological innovation comes primarily from deregulated markets is false. It is simply not true. Maybe in the 3rd century, maybe in the 7th century, maybe even in the 18th century, but not in the 19th and 20th centuries, not in, our lifetimes and recent history. If you look at all of the major technological innovations of the 20th century, and especially the ones that the tech bros love to boast about, the internet, GPS, computational systems, computers, computer language, aviation, railroads, radio, television, all of the things that made the modern world what it is, were all developed either by the public sector or by public-private partnerships with a big, big role for the visible hand of government, and particularly the internet. The internet was invented by the American government, by scientists paid for, contracted, organized by the U.S. Department of Defense. None of that was done by guys in hoodies in garages in Menlo Park. What those guys did was to, once the government declassified the internet, which was originally called ARPANET, they gave the opportunity for entrepreneurs to develop consumer products, and they did that well. And there's no question those people deserve credit for what they did. But they did not invent the internet. And without the internet, this whole universe, you and me talking today, none of this would have happened without the U.S. government. And why did the U.S. government develop the internet? Well, for military communications.
And I mean, you describe, I want to go into this also to use climate change as an example, because you describe climate change as a textbook for a market failure, textbook case. Why does opposition to regulation persist, even as, evidence mounts that the market is not efficient to drive sufficient innovation or sufficiently, quickly?
Well, exactly. I mean, that is exactly the point. We're not saying that innovation can't come from the private sector, but what we've seen, particularly in the case of climate change, is there has been innovation, but it hasn't come nearly as quickly or at the scale that we need. And where we have seen scaling, for example, in the decrease in the cost of photovoltaics, all of the people who've looked at that closely have concluded that government policies played a really, really major role in stimulating markets to do that work. So, market failure is really crucial to this whole story. And because it's really crucial, again, to the way in which this is an ideology that refuses to accept the evidence of its own refutation. So economists know that there's such a thing as market failure. We're not saying anything that any, first-year economics students doesn't know. And economists have for more than a century talked about the problem of so-called external costs. So by that, we mean if I buy something, I go to the market and I buy this pen, I pay a certain amount of money for it. It's pretty cheap, maybe $2, something like that. But what I'm not paying for is if that factory burned fossil fuels in making this pen, and that those fossil fuels put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that warmed the planet and caused damages. So now a hurricane in North Carolina leads to extreme flooding, which does billions and billions of dollars of damages. And I have not paid one penny of the cost of those damages, even though this pen contributed to it. So that's an external cost. And we don't pay those external costs in most cases in market-based systems. This has been known for a long time. And there are different ways. Economists have different ideas for how it could be remedied. And this was the idea of having putting a price on the external cost was developed by Arthur Pigou in the 1920s in the United Kingdom. So it's not a new idea. It's not a radical thing to say. And yet, what we find is that climate change deniers, by and large, are market fundamentalists who refuse to acknowledge the extent and the scale of the market failure and the external costs. And again, this is a complicated argument we could get into in detail. So why is that? Why can't they just say, okay, yeah, you're right, there are market failures, and we know how to fix them. We put a price on carbon, or we regulate the marketplace. I think the answer to that is that if you really scratch the surface of the climate crisis, and this is why I think the Merchants of Doubt story remains relevant and important, it isn't just about the climate crisis. When we wrote our book, what we saw was that the Merchants of Doubt, who we first came to know as climate deniers, were also tobacco deniers, ozone hole deniers, acid rain deniers. And so one of the questions is, well, why? Why would they deny the science in all these different areas, quite different areas and quite outside their own scientific expertise, and especially tobacco? Why would anyone defend tobacco when we know that tobacco has killed 100 million people in the 20th century? And so the answer to that is this market fundamentalist argument, this fear that if you allow the government to regulate markets, it's leading you into Soviet-style dictatorship. But I also think there's another aspect of it that is related, but I'm going to say it in a slightly different way. This is the Achilles heel of modern capitalism as presently practiced, right? If you begin to pull on that thread and you realize, well, it's not just carbon dioxide, it's also endocrine disrupting chemicals, it's pesticides, it's plastics. And so, okay, we could put a price on carbon, but will we also put a price on pesticides and endocrine disrupting chemicals and plastic? And the answer is, well, we actually probably should, because these things are all super damaging as well. But suddenly you are looking at a very, very regulated marketplace and something that is really different from the kind of capitalism that we have today. And that is not a small thing. And so I think it's that Achilles heel element, that external costs are really the Achilles heel of present day market capitalism as practiced.
But is it about fearing inefficiencies or fearing losing freedom or fearing, communism or whatever you call it, or knowing that in the US, communism is what France is, kind of? Or is it about, big money in the end? Like, I just want to make more money. I just want to have the freedom to protect myself and be apart from society. How do you balance that?
I think it's all of the above. I think whenever you see a large-scale historical phenomenon, it's never going to be just one thing. And often when something, in a way, market fundamentalism is a movement. And like any social movement, people come together under an umbrella, possibly for different reasons. And so if we go back to the Merchants of Doubt story, for those men, it was definitely about communism. They were scientists who had helped to build the American weapons and rocketry programs during the Cold War, which they understood as having been important in containing communism and in enabling the West to win the Cold War. And I think there's no question that they felt that authentically, and many of our readers might agree with that. So for them, it was about communism. They felt that the West had won the Cold War, but that market regulation was going to bring in socialism sort of through the back door. And they sometimes referred to environmentalists as reds under the bed. They call them watermelons, green on the outside, but red on the inside. So there's this sort of threat of creeping communism. And we see that argument being made yet again today in the United States. One time I gave a talk about Merchants of Doubt, and I said, look, we don't even have any communists left. And this was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And one student raised his hand and said, excuse me, I am a communist. Okay, so, the point is we don't have a credible communist party in the United States. We never really did. But this red baiting element persists and survives. But I don't think that's the dominant thing for most market fundamentalists today. I think for market fundamentalists today, there's more, it's really two things. It's about privilege and it's about big money. So a lot of climate change denial, and we and other people have demonstrated this, is funded by the fossil fuel industry. So even though the Merchants of Doubt may not have been motivated by money, big money is a huge part of this story because it's what sustains this whole project. And certainly that's the case in our new book, in The Big Myth. What we show in the book is how captains of industry, as I said a few minutes ago, really famous names in the history of American business like DuPont, Sloan, these people are part of their drivers, they're leaders of this movement, and they pay for these propaganda campaigns. They pay to bring von Mises and von Hayek to the United States. They pay to set up the free market project at the University of Chicago in order to sustain their position of power, money, and influence and privilege in American society. And I think we're seeing that being recapitulated today now by the big money Silicon Valley tech bros, these billionaires who have made more money than any person could possibly do anything with in a lifetime, and yet somehow still feel as if their prerogatives are being threatened. As when Elon Musk didn't used to be a reactionary, but he changed, and he changed partly during the pandemic, I think because he was really outraged that the government thought it had the right to shut down his factory for the common good. And his reaction to that was to say, how dare you? How dare you question me? He, a man who had built his fortune on government contracts to build satellites and other space stuff.
Well, I want to go into what you describe as epistemic arrogance as a key barrier to addressing market failures. Can you explain to me what this is? How do we break through this?
I need a moment.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I just need to take my glasses off. Yes, epistemic arrogance. Could you repeat the question?
No, so you describe, epistemic arrogance as a key barrier to addressing market failures, but can you explain to me what this is and how do we break through this ideological resistance, somehow?
Sure. Well, as I've said already a couple of times now, these people are not unintelligent and they're not uneducated. So if we want to understand how is it then that they can hold these views, even though we have so much evidence from history, from science, from economics, that these views are at best they're half-truths and at worst they're lies. So part of this, I think, has to do with the fact that often people in position of privilege live in epistemic bubbles. They live in worlds where the people they talk to believe the same things they do. I mean, middle class and working class people can have that experience too. But the difference is, if I'm a working class person, I don't have the same opportunity to surround myself with people who believe all the same things I do in the way that a very wealthy and privileged person can do. A working class person has to ride the metro to work, is going to see the headlines in papers that they maybe don't read, but they still see those headlines. A working class person will encounter other people in their lives who will challenge their views. But really wealthy people can fly in their own private jets, surround themselves with people who agree with them, go to invitation-only conferences at Davos or wherever, in which they are more likely to be able to build self-reinforcing networks and environments. And that enables them, I think, more than working in middle-class people, or more even than a college professor who has to, I have to confront students who disagree, and they do actively, and that's good. And that makes it, I think, easier for them to believe that the claims they are making are true and to persuade themselves that they are working for the common good, even while they collect $53 billion in salary or whatever it is.
But some argue also that the skepticism toward government is warranted, not arrogant. How do you differentiate between healthy skepticism and harmful denial?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, all of our work is really, grappling with that question all the time. And especially because Erik Conway and I come at this from the position of historians of science and technology. And of course, skepticism is absolutely central to science. Healthy skepticism, curiosity, critical interrogation. These are core values of science. And one of the reasons why I get really angry at climate change deniers is when they try to take the strength of science and use it against science. So climate change deniers will say, oh, but I'm a skeptic. I'm doing something good. Well, but there's healthy skepticism, there's corrosive skepticism, and there's denial. And so when there's already been a healthy debate, when scientists have published huge amounts of data in peer-reviewed literature and written popular books as well, lots and lots of articles, and we've had the opportunity to ask the questions that need to be asked, at that point, if you still reject it, that's not healthy skepticism. That's something else. So when it comes to government, so this is obviously a tricky question. And again, it's why the book is long. It's one reason the book is long. So obviously, a certain amount of healthy skepticism about concentration of power is essential in any democratic polity. And of course, the Enlightenment ideals, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the work of people like Tom Paine, John Locke, these are all rooted in healthy skepticism about the risk of overly concentrated power in centralized government. But two things I want to say about that. Everything in life is context dependent. So when the biggest threat to liberty was a monarch, a corrupt monarch, King George III, Louis the 16th, then of course people are going to be talking about how we have to fight against, the concentration of power in this corrupt individual. But here we are now, more than 200 years later, we're in a very different world. And in fact, one of the ironies of our current situation is that if you ask yourself, well, where are the greatest concentrations of corrupt power in the world today? I think you'd have to say, or at least maybe the word corrupt is unfair, the greatest concentrations of power that potentially threaten the democratic polity, it's in corporations. It's in big multinational corporations that act with impunity, that can break the laws of countries and get away with it, that corrupt governments. And we see this all around the globe. And this is one of the hypocrisies of the current generation of market fundamentalists. They're obsessed with government power in a moment where actually I think the biggest threat to the common good, the biggest threat to the environment, the biggest threat to the climate system. The threat to the climate system is not from the U.S. government. The threat to the climate system is from ExxonMobil, Total, BP, Shell, all the fossil fuel companies that are deliberately, consciously, knowingly continuing to pursue a strategy of fossil fuel development that we know has already disrupted the climate system and has the potential to do huge amounts of damage, trillions of dollars of damage every year across the globe, and doing that with impunity, and no government seems to have the capacity or the wherewithal to stop it.
Well, now you have Trump as president-elect. You have Elon Musk, which is leading the libertarian, renaissance in the U.S. And so basically they are taking over in a strong way. What alternatives to market fundamentalism do you envision, and what would it take to shift this dominant narrative now?
Well, they pull a jujitsu move on science, as I just said, using the strength of science against it. So I think we have a jujitsu move available to us. So I think one part of their argument that is correct is about the distribution of power, that concentrations of power in any place or any individual can threaten freedom. And that's why I make the point that we need to be worried about concentrations of power in multinational corporations. So what is the alternative to that? Well, here in the United States, one good thing about America is that states have a lot of power, and actually cities have a lot of power too. And so we can think about this argument about distribution of power and say, well, that piece of the argument is actually not a bad one. There's a lot to be said about the benefits of distributed power. And of course, people on the left have been saying this for a long time as well. This is a place where the right and the left sometimes meet. So in the United States, we have a very robust structure of state governance, and states have a lot of power. And in fact, in some ironic way, they may even have more power now based on some of the recent decisions of the Supreme Court. So I think that people who are concerned about, well, any issue, healthcare, climate change, workers' rights, minimum wages, much of this can be addressed in the United States on the state level. Now, I don't know as much about France and how much the provinces do or don't have authority, but it seems to me very little. Okay, so France, you have a little bit of a different kind of problem. But of course, in France, you don't have Elon Musk. So you have other issues, of course. But I think thinking about the ways in which power can be devolved, and I just gave my last lecture of the semester yesterday, and this is what I ended the lecture with, to think about, in the United States, I said to my students, when I say the word government, close your eyes, what do you imagine? And they said, of course, what I knew they would, the White House, Congress, Washington, D.C. And that's true. Washington, D.C. has a lot of power. But stop and think for a minute. We have 50 states with 50 state houses in this country. Lots of power there that could be used. And then I asked my students, how many of you have ever even visited a state house? No one. How many of you could name one thing that the state legislature in Massachusetts did this week or even this month? No one. Most of us in the United States pay no attention to the levers of power on the state level. So that's a giant opportunity for us to rethink how power operates in this country. And that's my kind of optimistic, vision of a future. It's what I would call a renewed vision of states' rights, right? States' rights got really discredited in the United States because it was associated with the defense of slavery. But it doesn't have to be that. There could be a progressive version of states' rights.
And which could end up also breaking the union, some people say.
Well, I don't know. I don't want to go there because, that could be viewed as seditious and I could be sent to jail. I'm not saying I want to break up the United States, but I am saying that, and California has already done it in many ways with their climate law, AB 32. One thing I also like to emphasize in the United States, the economy of California is as big as the economy of France. Yeah. So, if California were a country, we'd all be celebrating the amazing progress they've made on climate change. And it's particularly strange in the United States, like Norway does something like, eliminating internal combustion engines, and everyone celebrates. And that's good. And I love Norway. But 7 million people in Norway? I mean, there's more people than that in New York City. So there are tremendous opportunities for action in the United States if we shift our focus away from, the president-elect and his strange advisors and think about the power we have on other levels.
Last question, because I know you got to go. If you could leave listeners with one actionable takeaway, what would it be?
One actionable takeaway. Well, that's a great question. I'm glad you posed it that way, because in America, I always get asked, what can I personally do? And so I always quote Bill McKibben, who says, the most important thing you can do as an individual is not try to solve this problem as an individual, but join an organization, join a group, find common cause with other people who are addressing the problem in a way that feels meaningful for you. But since you didn't pose it that way, the one actionable thing, well, I do. So the whole thing about personal action versus political action is complicated because political action ultimately is what is required. but it's a long game and it can feel depressing. And so sometimes thinking about what you can do individually is empowering. And in the United States, the single most important thing that most Americans could do to reduce their carbon footprint and also help workers and the environment would be to eat less meat. Americans eat about twice as much meat as a typical European, has huge carbon footprint, especially beef, terrible for workers, huge amounts of pesticides and antibiotics being used. And if we would all just reduce our meat consumption, we don't even have to become vegans. If we just reduced our meat consumption to what French people did, we'd be healthier, we'd be happier, it'd be good for the planet, and then we could drink more wine with the money we save from not eating beef.
Yeah, and that's not against your freedom, I guess.
It's not against your freedom.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I'm going to stop there. Thanks a lot for your time. Thanks a lot for your insights. And I'll share the links to the French version of the book on the website as usual.
Okay, and you'll of course be. And I think Amanda already sent you the materials, right? But you will be sure to tell people that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
of course. Excellent.
I will.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Nice to speak with you. Take care.